The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that we discussed many times that the inyan of Rashi in his commentary on the Torah is, as Rashi himself says the rule, and I only came from Pshut Shel Mikra for the simple meaning of the pasuk. And even in those places where at first glance it seems to be that Rashi is bringing a drasha of Chazal, when we look carefully on the drasha, we will see that this is something that's absolutely necessary for the understanding the simple pshat of the pasuk, unless if Rashi will himself say something to the effect of Rabbi Seinu Darshu, our rabbis expounded and taught, etc. Says the Rebbe, this is noticeable in a very, very clear way in Rashi and our parsha. Rashi says a pirush that when we look into the sources from where Rashi is taking this pirush, we'll see that these are three separate drashos of Chazal. One is from the Gemara, the second one is from Sifri in Parshas Vayelech, and finally a drasha that says in Sifri on our parsha, on the pasuk that Rashi brings it. And in their sources, these drashas, these different explanations, are not connected with each other, and yet Rashi in his commentary on the Torah joins all three together as one pirush. So we must say that they are very relevant to the meaning of the pasuk, which connects them all together, and therefore also the order of how Rashi brings them is also something that's relevant in Pshut Shel Mikra, as will be explained. So this is on the pasuk Vayavi Moshe. Moshe comes, Vayidaber, and he speaks to the Bnei Yisrael. Him who Hoshea Binun, Moshe Rabbeinu along with Hoshea Binun. Rashi quotes from the pasuk the words Hu Hoshea Binun, and he explains Shabbos shall Diuzugi Hoisa. This was a Shabbos of Diuzugi, two pairs. Nitlo Rishus Mizeh, permission, authority was being taken from one, the Nitno Lazen being given to the other. Rashi continues and says, Hamidloi Moshe Meturgaman Liyoshua. Moshe had set up a spokesman, a translator, a spokesman for Yehoshua, that Yehoshua should already be speaking to the Bnei Yisrael. He should be doirish, he should be darshaning b'chayav in Moshe's lifetime, so that Yidden wouldn't be able to say later, while your Rebbe was alive, you didn't dare lift up your head. In other words, you weren't in a position to be able to be a leader and a person to speak, etc. And now you're coming, sort of the implication is that now suddenly you think you can become a leader. So Moshe Rabbeinu is already setting him up right now. He's already becoming a leader. Then Rashi continues, why does he call him Hoshea over here? It's to teach us that Yeshua didn't become haughty in any way. He didn't become arrogant in any way. Even though he was being given all this greatness, he was still humble as he was right in the beginning, right from the outset. Says the Rebbe, the beginning of this Rashi, that this was a Shabbos of two people, of two pairs, and that the permission was being taken from one and given to the other. This is in the Gemara in Saita. The continuation of Rashi, that Moshe Rabbeinu set up a Meturgam and a spokesman for Yeshua, this is in Sifri in Parshas Vayelech. And the point of the end of the Rashi, of why he's being called Hoshea over here, this is in our pasuk in the Sifri. So the first question is, why is Rashi joining these three different statements in one pirush? Furthermore, says the Rebbe, in regards to the first two ideas of Rashi, that number one, again, there was a Shabbos of two pairs, of two people together, and that Moshe Rabbeinu set up a Meturgam and a translator for Yeshua, at least these two, you could say, are basically connected. The content of them is generally the same idea. In other words, that the second point of Moshe Rabbeinu is setting up a translator, a spokesman for Yeshua. This is also emphasizing this idea that permission is now being moved over, authority is being moved over from Moshe to Yeshua. And so at least these two, we could see the connection between them. But the third point of why Yeshua is being called Hoshea over here seems to be dealing with another point completely that is not directly connected to the previous ideas. And yet, not only does Rashi put it into the same Dibra Maschil, but he puts it with a Vav, connecting it to the previous point. And why does the Torah call him over here Hoshea? As if the question is specifically coming in continuation to the previous points that we mentioned, that it was a Shabbos of two pairs, and that Moshe Rabbeinu set him up a Meturgam, a spokesman, as if it's now we have the question, so why does the Torah call him over here Hoshea? The Rebbe says this question of why Rashi is joining these three different points together is even more when we have a look at earlier Rashis. That is, not only is in the source of Rashi these three separate explanations, different Sfarim and different Midrashi Chazal, but Rashi himself brings the first 2 points elsewhere, and each one of them he brings by itself without the need to bring the other one as well. That is, in Parshas Pinchas, on the pasuk "V'samachto es yodcha olav," Hashem tells Moshe, you should lean your hands on Yeshua. Rashi says, "Ten loy meturgamon," give him a spokesman. Sheyidrash b'chayecha, that he should be speaking in your lifetime. Shelo yoimru olav, that they shouldn't say the same point we mentioned before, that in the time of Moshe your Rebbe, in the time of Moshe you didn't dare speak. So it's the same idea that Rashi says over here, but he only mentions this point. In the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, on the pasuk loy ucha loy lotzis v'lovi, that Moshe says, I can no longer go out and come in. Rashi says, I am not allowed to because permission was taken from me and given to Yeshua. So here again, Rashi just mentions one of the points of our Rashi. So in other words, according to Rashi, these two ideas, again, the two ideas that permission is being going from Moshe to Yeshua, and the idea that Moshe is setting up a meturgam and a spokesman for Yeshua, clearly they're not dependent on each other. They can be said separately in different psukim by Rashi and as different points. So why over here does Rashi need to connect them together? Another question, says the Rebbe. In the Gemara, this idea of Shabbos shall do zugi hoisa, this was a Shabbos of these two people coming together, permission going from one to the other. The Gemara says this idea on a different pasuk. In fact, it's on an earlier pasuk. It's a pasuk in Parshas Vayelech, where it says Vayelech Moshe v'Yeshua. Moshe and Yeshua went and they stood in the oil moed. It's on that pasuk that the Gemara says this. Seemingly, says the Rebbe, Rashi should have brought all of that on that pasuk in Parshas Vayelech, where we have this expression for the first time of Moshe and Yeshua going together. Rashi should have brought it over there. Says the Rebbe is attempting an answer now. Says the Rebbe, we can say it. We cannot say that since Rashi brought the general idea of this point already in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, as said before, because we said in the beginning of Vayelech, we said Rashi said already that permission was given from Moshe to Yeshua. So you might say, since it's said already in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, this general idea, so therefore Rashi does not have to mention it in the continuation of Parshas Vayelech, where it speaks about Moshe and Yeshua going together to the oil moed. And that's why Rashi doesn't say it over there. But the Rebbe says, if that's the case, then why does Rashi have to repeat it in our Parsha? Furthermore, it's in our Parsha that he's suddenly elaborating even more and speaking about this idea of Shabbos shel diuzugi oiso, that this is a Shabbos of these two coming together. Another question, says the Rebbe. In regards to this idea of Hamid loy Moshe meturgamon, that Moshe Rabbeinu had set up a spokesman for Yeshua. So here too we have the question. Since Rashi said this already in Parshas Pinchas, that Hashem told Moshe to appoint a meturgamon for Yeshua, and surely Moshe Rabbeinu did it. So why does Rashi need to repeat it in our Parsha? And even if we want to say that we find this a number of times in Rashi, that's something that he explained in an earlier Sefer in Chumash, he will repeat it in a later Chumash. And surely over here, where it's not even exactly the same thing, because in Parshas Pinchas it's speaking about Hashem giving the order of giving Yeshua this meturgamon. In our Parsha, it's about how it was actually done by Moshe Rabbeinu giving him the meturgamon. So even if you say that, but it's still not understood, why does Rashi need to repeat all the details? Also the reason, Kedei shelo yoimru Yisrael, so the Yidden shouldn't say that in the lifetime of Moshe you didn't raise your head, and who are you now, so to speak? Since Rashi explained this already in Parshas Pinchas. Because as discussed a number of times, even when Rashi does repeat a pirush that he said earlier, he will usually just do it in a concise form, in a brief form. And in those places where Rashi is repeating all the details, it must be because somehow it's necessary because of these psukim over here. Another question. This expression, Shabbos shel diuzugi, in the Gemara, Rashi explains what this word diuzugi means. Rashi says, Shnei zugos, diuzugi means two pairs, meaning two chaverim, there were two chaverim, two people were on this Shabbos. In the beginning of the day, it was for Moshe. That the beginning of Shabbos, Moshe had the authority, and the end of the day was Yeshua's. What's Rashi saying in the Gemara? Well, simply what he's coming to clarify is that Diu Zugi should not be translated in the literal sense. That Zug means a pair. In other words, two people that come together at the same time. Because the leadership of Moshe was in the beginning of the day, and Yeshua was at the end of the day. Not that they were there as a pair, both together, and therefore Rashi is saying that Zug over here is to be understood as two chaverim, two friends, but they weren't actually together. So the question is, if Rashi needs to explain this in the Gemara, we know the Gemara is learned by Ben Chamesh Esrei, a 15-year-old starts learning Gemara. If a 15-year-old who's learning Gemara needs the explanation of what Diu Zugi means, surely in Limud al Pi Pshat to a Ben Chamish Lemikra, surely Rashi would have to explain what this means. And yet Rashi just uses this word Diu Zugi without even explaining what it means. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand all of this by first having a look and clarifying the difference in the expressions of the way Rashi says it compared to its source in the Sifri. So in the Sifri, it says, Ten loy meturgaman lo Yeshua. Hashem is telling Moshe Rabbeinu to give Yeshua a spokesman. Vu shoyel v'doiresh u'moyre bo'hiroyes b'chayecha. He's going to ask and expound and give instruction during your lifetime. So that when you pass away, Yidden won't say that during the life of Moshe Rebbe, you didn't speak, and now you're speaking. So that's in the Sifri. Whereas Rashi says, he speaks also about the same idea, that he should be explaining and saying things during Moshe Rabbeinu's life. But Rashi says adds these words, or says this expression, in the time of your Rebbe, you shouldn't have raised your head. What is the special meaning of raising your head? A second point. In regards to the reason why he's being called Hoshea over here, in the Sifri it says, it's coming to teach you the righteousness of Yeshua. In other words, he may have thought that somehow he felt higher, greater, once he was given all of this authority. So the pasuk says, "Hu v'Hoshea binun." He, Moshe Rabbeinu, along with Hoshea binun. It's coming to say that Hoshea remains in his tzidkos, he remains in his righteousness, even though he was appointed a leader over the community now. Nevertheless, Hu Hoshea means he also refers to Yeshua himself. Remained the same Yeshua. He's the same Hoshea that remained in his righteousness. However, Rashi says something different. Shalei zocha da'at that he didn't feel haughty, even though he was given greatness. Hishpil atzmi. He doesn't speak about his righteousness. He speaks about the fact that he felt himself humble and lowly, kasher metchilosai, as he was right at the beginning. Says the Rebbe, the explanation of all of this is, the reason why Rashi doesn't say this idea of Shabbos shel diuzugi, he said this was a Shabbos that was shared between these two pairs, between these two people, right in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, rather he says it again in our Parsha, is because over there in Parshas Vayelech, there's actually no necessity to say that it actually started, the Nesius of Yeshua actually started already. Why? Because even though Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, on the words again, I can no longer go out and come in, he says, I'm not allowed because permission was taken from me and given to Yeshua. But it doesn't mean that it happened already, right then. Rashi himself continues in the continuation of that pirush. Rashi says, "V'Hashem Omar Elai." That when Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Hashem said to me that I cannot go across the Yarden," Rashi says that's the meaning, that's the explanation why I can no longer go out and come in, is because Hashem told me you're not going to be crossing the Yarden. In other words, the fact that permission is going from Moshe to Yeshua is not necessarily relevant right now and today. Rather, we can learn that what it means is, in other words, it's referring to the time that Moshe Rabbeinu is not going to be able to be crossing the Yarden. So it doesn't mean that when Moshe Rabbeinu is saying Lo ucha lo yidlotzes v'lavi necessarily means that right now Yeshua's leadership is starting. It means when it's time to cross the Yarden, I will no longer be able to do this. So too in the pasuk, which we said before, is the pasuk that's used in the source of Rashi. The pasuk Vayelech Moshe v'Yisyatzvu, Moshe v'Yeshua v'Yisyatzvu b'Oil Moed, where Moshe and Yeshua go and they stand in the Oil Moed, which is later on in Parshas Vayelech. So here too, we could say that the fact that Yeshua is going together with Moshe to the Oil Moed, that doesn't mean yet that Yeshua is right now becoming the leader of the Yidden. Rather, it's in order to fulfill what Hashem said. Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, call Yeshua, and you'll both stand in the Oil Moed, and I will encourage Yeshua, etc. So it doesn't mean yet that he's becoming leader right now. Whereas when it comes to our Parsha, when it says Vayidaber, that Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking, Hu v'Hoshea binun, him along with Hoshea binun, the question becomes, what is the point of the pasuk of putting Yeshua now together with Moshe? How does Yeshua or Hoshea come into the picture over here? Yes, it's true, Yeshua is always with Moshe Rabbeinu. He's never moving away from the tent of Moshe. He's always with Moshe. But why is the Torah suddenly specifically mentioning it here? So we must say that when it says Hu v'Hoshea binun, it's referring to the Vayidaber that it says in the beginning of the pasuk. In other words, after Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu said the Shira, the pasuk is telling us Hu v'Hoshea binun. Who is the one that said the Shira? It was not only Moshe, but it was also Yeshua binun. He also said it in the ears of the people. Furthermore, from the fact that it says Hu v'Hoshea binun, which seemingly the word Hu is extra over here, it's telling us that the Torah, by emphasizing that Moshe and Yeshua are both saying it, they're saying it in an equal way. Hu v'Hoshea binun, they're both saying it in the same exact way. In the way they're speaking, in other words, they're both speaking in the style of a Nasi speaking to Bnei Yisrael. This is why Rashi over here has to tell us that Shabbos shall Yuzugi Hoysa, this was a Shabbos of two pairs. And Rashi doesn't even have to explain what that means. As we said, the Gemara has to explain. In the Gemara, Rashi explains what the Yuzugi means. Because what Rashi means is exactly as the word sounds. That it was actually a Shabbos of both of them together as a pair. In other words, let's just go back for a minute to what we said before. In the Gemara, Rashi was explaining, the way we understood it from the Gemara, Rashi over there had to explain that it doesn't mean that they were both there at the same time. And that's why Rashi had to explain the word diuzugi, that it means they were two friends, one in the beginning of the day, one at the end of the day. But over here, in Pshuta Shel Mikra, we're actually learning, no, it was a pair. They were actually both together. So you don't have to translate the word zug. Zug means a pair. It was only when we needed to translate it differently, that's where Rashi had to say something. And with this, Rashi is clarifying that when he says afterwards, Nitla Rishus Mizev and Nitno Lazer, Rishus was being given from one and given to the other, it does not mean that Nesius of Moshe was over now, and now is going to start the next period, Yeshua, but rather they're actually a Zug both together. So what does it mean that permission is being taken from Moshe? It doesn't mean that it's completely being taken. What it means is Moshe Rabbeinu is no longer as he was before, the only Nasi. As Rashi calls it, Dabar Echad Lador, there's only one leader for a generation, but rather, something is changing now already. Together with Moshe, there's already Yeshua as well, and that's why it can be called Nitla Rishus Mizeh, V'nitno Lazeh. It's being taken from Moshe and being given to Yeshua. Says the Rebbe, now we'll understand why Rashi adds the next part of Hamid Loi Moshe Meturgum Yeshua, that Moshe is giving the spokesman that Yeshua should have a spokesman. And he doesn't just say the words, Nitla Rishus Mizeh, the permission is being taken from one and given to the other, as he said in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech. Because that's the whole chiddush that we're saying over here in our pasuk, Hu v'Hoshea binun. That Yeshua is actually speaking to the Yidden in exactly the same way Moshe speaks to the Yidden. In a way of Nesius, like a leader. Yeshua was speaking in the ears of the people like a Nasi speaks, that is with a Meturgam, with a spokesman. Says the Rebbe, now will also understand the chiddush of what Rashi is saying over here compared to what he said in Parshas Pinchas, where he also spoke about this idea that Hashem told Moshe to give Yeshua a spokesman to speak even during Moshe's life. That is, in Parshas Pinchas, when Yeshua is being given a spokesman, it's not in a way of Nesius. It's not in a way that he's now becoming leader. It's just in order to ensure that the Yidden won't be able to later say that you didn't lift your head in the times of Moshe. So therefore he's being told, no, we'll give him a spokesman, and he should speak during your lifetime as well. But in our Pasha, Rashi is saying it in continuation to what we just said, Shabbos shol yuzugi hoisa, nitla rishus mizev nitno lazeh, that means that it's by Yeshua in a way of Nesius, together with Moshe Rabbeinu, Diuzugi, Yeshua is mamish becoming now the peer, together with Moshe Rabbeinu. But then Rashi has to continue. Rashi cannot just suffice with this. He can't just say Shabbos shel Diuzugi Hoisa, that it was a Shabbos of these two pairs together, and that Moshe gave him a Maturgaman. Because if that's the case, we have a very big question. Why, in fact, was this Seder needed? That Yeshua's Nesius should start already in the lifetime of Moshe, opposite of the rule of Daber Echad Lader, usually there's only one leader per generation. So yes, it's true that we needed that Moshe should appoint Yeshua as the Mamale Mokim, but why is there a need that Yeshua, the Talmud of Moshe, should actually act in a way of Nesius in the lifetime of his Rebbe Moshe, and in a way of Diuzugi, that they're both there together? And not the way we usually find it by the other Mamale Mokim of the previous Nesiim, that the Nesius of the Mamale Mokim, of the one who's coming next, even if he was appointed already in advance, but it still practically only started after the passing of the previous Nasi. And this is why Rashi adds these words, Shelo Yoimru Yisrael, Yidden shouldn't say, that during the lifetime of Moshe, you didn't raise your head. That is, it's specifically by Yeshua there was a need for this special raising that Moshe needed to do, because during the whole time of Moshe's life, Yeshua was actually exactly the opposite. He was actually going the opposite direction. The opposite of Roimim is the opposite of raising himself. He was acting in a complete way of bittul and humility and being humble, lowliness. Yeshua's whole essence was in the fact that he's Misharis Moshe, he's just Moshe's servant. As the pasuk says, Mishar so Yeshua Na'ar, he's like a young lad, Lo Yomish, never moving from the tent. He's constantly standing in this state of bittul, absolute bittul, like a Na'ar, like a young lad, and a Misharis, a servant. The Rebbe says, not like we find, for example, by Aaron, that even though, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu is the Nasi, and yet Aaron himself also teaches Torah to all of the Yidden, as Rashi actually brings the whole order of how Torah would be taught. But by Yeshua, we don't find any of this sort of leadership, raising himself, holding himself high, teaching Yidden in any way up until now at all. And therefore, it was specifically necessary that the Yidden shouldn't be able to say, during the time of your Rebbe, you never lifted your head at all. You were never a leader at all in any way whatsoever. In other words, since Yeshua was missing this idea completely of lifting himself in any way whatsoever during the lifetime of his Rebbe. And therefore, they might say, you're not capable of being a leader by Yidden. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu needed to give him the Meturgaman to Yeshua, that he should darshan during his lifetime. Says the Rebbe, with this we'll now understand the continuation of Rashi. Why does he call him Hoshea over here? To teach you that he didn't act in an arrogant, that he didn't feel haughty in any way whatsoever. And Rashi goes further and he's medayik in the words, he held himself humble, like all the way in the beginning. Not like in the Sifri where it says that Yeshua was the same tzaddik like before. The question over here is not just simply why is he being called Hoshea after he was already called Yeshua. The question is, why is he over here in our pasuk being called Hoshea? Seemingly, on the contrary, it's specifically in this pasuk that he should have been called Yeshua. Why? Since the whole point of the pasuk is coming to emphasize how important it is haramas rosh, lifting Yeshua. He should be in a raised position of a leader, etc. in the time of Moshe, even during the lifetime of Moshe. So how is it that right over here the pasuk is choosing to call him Hoshea, which is the name that he had before Moshe gave him the name Yeshua? Which is reminiscent of the fact that Yeshua needs a special tefillah from Moshe, that in the future Hashem should help you from the advice, from the plots of the Meraglim and all of that. And this is what Rashi is coming to explain, that on the contrary, it's actually to teach you the Maila of Yeshua, the special virtue of Yeshua, that he didn't feel haughty in any way, even though he was being given all of this greatness, he's holding himself lowly as he was right in the beginning. That is, the nature of a person is that when he goes up to greatness, so suddenly his midos, his character traits, his conduct is changing in accordance to the change in him and all of his greatness, all of his high position. Especially when he's being given something of nesius, of leadership, someone that's being appointed as the nasi. This is going to bring out in the person a certain tenuah, or great tenuah of greatness and holding himself up higher. Not chas v'shalom in a way of gaiv, in a way of arrogance and yeshus chas v'shalom. But within Kedusha itself, it's a certain motion of that even Torah itself demands that he's now being held higher over other people so that he can be able to rule and have his leadership properly. As Rashi himself brings, that Hashem said, he tells Yeshua, take a stick and hit the people over their heads. In other words, there is a need for this holding himself greater and higher, seemingly over the people. And this is what the Torah is telling us. That despite all of this, the Yeshua is being given all of this greatness. And surely he got, with Moshe Rabbeinu giving him the smicha, he got ba'ayin yafa with a good eye, all of the necessary greatness and height that a nasi needs to have. But at the same time, Yeshua still had this feeling of absolute shiftless, absolute bittul and lowliness as he was right at the outset. That is just like he was before he was being given any greatness. What was he? He was just Mesharas Moshe, the servant of Moshe, acting in a complete humble way. So too afterwards, even once he's being given all of this greatness, he remains in the same exact mode of absolute humility. He's holding himself humble as right in the beginning. Says the Rebbe, we could say that this is also connected to something that Rashi told us earlier already, that Moshe's face is compared to the sun, and Yeshua's to that of the moon. That is, that Yeshua always feels that he is a makabel, he's just a recipient from Moshe, like the moon receiving from the sun, and therefore again standing always constantly with this absolute level of humility. The Rebbe concludes with a hira that we could take in our avoid, in the avoid of each and every person. Just like it was by Yeshua, that after he's zoicha to go up to this greatness, and not only to any greatness, he's going up to the greatest type of position, Nesius, even in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And furthermore, in a way of, as we said, Yuzugi, he's standing together with Moshe Rabbeinu, leading together with Moshe Rabbeinu. And yet, he was humble right at the beginning. Says the Rebbe, in a similar way, is by every Yid. Especially we know that Moshe, Mesara, gave over everything to Yeshua. And all of, as the Rebbe points out in the footnote over here, that all of the inyanim of Moshe Rabbeinu are by every single Yid. A spark of Moshe Rabbeinu in every Yid, and everything's being given over to Yeshua. So every Yid is a shaykhs to the savoid of Yeshua. That when a person is zoicha to an inyan of godless of greatness, an inyan of leadership, or other sorts of greatness, that he's zoicha, that he gets great brachis from Hashem. So a person can make some sort of calculation that the actual fact that he was the one that was zoicha to this sort of greatness, that's a sign that he's truly fitting for it. And therefore it brings out in him some sort of form of what the Rebbe calls harchavas hadas, some sort of feeling of expansion of his mind, etc. Not in the way of gaiva chas v'shalom, but at least some sort of feeling expansive and greater, etc. So we learn from Yeshua on the contrary. Specifically, when one is zoicha to an inyan of greatness, he needs to have the humility like all the way in the beginning. And that itself becomes the keli, the vessel, for the greatness that he's being given, that should endure, that should last. The Rebbe says this is all connected also to the time of the year when we read this parsha of the Torah. We read it after and very close to the time of Rosh Hashanah. The avoid of Rosh Hashanah, Hashem says to the Yidden that you should say in front of me the psukim of Malchias, so that you crown me, you coronate me, you make me your king. Yidden are the ones making Hashem Melech, the Melech Yisrael, and through that also the Melech on the whole world. Now, since the idea of Melucha, of this kingship, is happening through the avoid of the Yid, this obviously shows the importance, the greatness of the Yid. They are the ones that have the power to crown Hashem as king. And therefore, this could again lead to some sort of thought that a person could have some sort of tenuah, some sort of feeling that's not the complete opposite of complete humility. Says the Rebbe, for this we have the Ira on the contrary. It's specifically after the Yidden are doing such an amazing, great thing, crowning Hashem as Melech. But that needs to bring within the Yid a tenuah of absolute bittul, like Yeshua, that hishpilatzma, that held himself specifically low. And through this adds even more in the brachos of Hashem and everything one needs, in achsim and agmar chsim toiva, l'shana toiva, mesuka b'toiva, nirav anigla, l'mata me'asar tvachim, with bon echayu, mezoiner vichit, children, health, parnasa, all in a comfortable and expansive way, or bekulam revichi, in all of these things in the most abundant way.